conference on differentiated integration. What we have now ahead of us for the next 90 minutes is a more normative discussion on the merits of differentiation. So the title of this session is Demoi-cracy or Domination, Normative Perspectives on Differentiated Integration. We have two speakers who will present an introduction and we'll play them off against each other and try to stimulate some debate. But you're certainly also very welcome to make your own contributions. We have a Q&A function on the Zoom. So if you have a question, please enter it in there and I will forward those questions to the speakers as soon as I have the chance. Now, the big question, of course, that we'll be discussing is very much the relation between differentiated integration and democracy. Is there a natural positive relation? Is differentiation an expression of self-determination and the choice to step in or step out? Or does differentiation come with all kinds of domination and exclusion? And for that, we have two eminent speakers, both from outside the European Union. You need an outside perspective, or in a way, they are subject to some form of differentiation if exclusion is also a form of differentiation. So on the one hand, we have Richard Bellamy, Professor of Political Science at University College London, who is also associated to the INDIF EU project, and last year published an impressive monograph, A Republican Europe of States. It also touches upon this question. And on the other hand, from Oslo, Norway, we have Professor Jon-Erik Fossum, who is in the ARENA Center for European Studies, associated to the University of Oslo, and is a project coordinator for the EU 3D project. And he also published several books that speak to Brexit, actually. That's nice to have somebody from Oslo speaking on Squaring the Circle on Brexit together with Hans-Petter Graver 2 years ago. And earlier already a book with Erik Otvar Eriksson on the European Union's non-members. So I'm sure that both speakers will draw on that experience. We will have introductory statements, but just to make sure that we keep it a bit grounded, I was going to ask Richard and Jon-Erik some quick questions. And one to start with, Richard, is what for you would be the paradigm case of benign differentiation? If we are to have differentiation, can you point to an example where you say, well, this really works how it should be working? You have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Probably almost anything that I choose is going to be controversial, but I think that not joining the euro is one that I would regard as benign. And yeah, Denmark and the UK, of course, were the two cases. No, I can't hear.
And Sweden is an interesting case, I guess, which is still under pressure to join if they would meet the criteria. Yeah. Maybe I can play the opposite question to Jon-Erik. What for you is a particularly malign, unsuccessful, and normatively undesirable example of differentiation?
Well, actually, I think I'll take two. And basically not talking so much about the differentiated integration process, but more in terms of the structuring of a system. So I see two scenarios that are particularly problematic. One is centralization without any kind of accountability, so that the concentration of power that depletes democracy, both at the European and the member state level, is one. That's a kind of a concentration of power. It will still be differentiated because it would be governed by institutions, by a set of institutions then probably at the EU level that would basically sideline all kinds of democratic accountability mechanisms at both types of levels. So that would be a sort of a illicit hierarchy, you can say, and therefore also like either technocracy or executive dominance would be one manifestation of this. The other scenario, the opposite, is a fragmentation. And that is if differentiation is out of control and I think the thing that some of the Eurosceptics don't take sufficiently seriously is that this unraveling the EU will not stop at the nation-state borders. It will also actually change the political topography of Europe, because it will go into states as well. So it will set up a kind of anarchic situation of arbitrary dominance, basically. So I think these are the kind of outer poles where dominance comes in as a central element. In both cases, there's an excessive amount of order, and the other one, there's a lack of order, basically.
Okay, so it's very clear that we're talking about much more forms of the differentiation can take than just opt-ins and opt-outs. Although I guess one of the indications is that indeed you want to have a good mapping of institutions and practices and indeed expressed will of the countries mostly involved. And indeed, when that mismatch increases, when we have institutional arrangements that are not matched by practice on the ground, then normative problems may well be lurking around the corner, either when we have too much institutionalization and practices that don't map on that, or indeed when there's fragmentation and anarchy. That's already, I think, a good starting point, but it also shows, I guess, that we're talking to quite a broad repertoire. What we invited both of you to do is to give us a basic stance on the good and bad of differentiated integration as you see them. We start with Richard for about 15 minutes, and then we move to John Eric, and then we move into a bit of conversation between your two perspectives and see where they agree and where they disagree. And then, of course, I hope that already there's plenty of people in the audience waiting to trigger their questions at you. But if I can proceed, Richard, would you be willing to take the floor for us and present your slides and unmute yourself? Sorry, you're still muted, Richard. You're still muted. Oh, well, you have to switch back from PowerPoint to Zoom. Can I mute you?
All right, is that okay? Can you hear me now? Okay, so I'm just saying I'm going to stand up because I find that I stay awake, and therefore hopefully other people stay awake if I'm standing. So this is what I'm going to look at the, as Ben said, what I'm going to say is partly based on a recent book, and chapter 6 deals with this very issue. I'm going to look at what domination is, because I think there is some difference between myself and John Eric on that. Then how it relates to Demoi-cracy, and then how it can help avoid domination, and possibly how it can create it. So what's domination? So I basically adopt Philip Pettit's neo-republican view of domination as the ability of an agent or agency, such as a government, arbitrarily, that is at will, to impose certain choices on others without consulting their reasons or interests. And that can happen either directly through interference, or often indirectly through simply the presence of a more powerful actor being there, through intimidation, for example. And normally it's attributed to three conditions: that there's a power imbalance, a degree of dependency of the dominated on the dominator, and an element of personal rule. That is, that you don't have to go through processes and procedures in order to exert this choice on others. And the archetype of it, in personal terms, is that of a slave to a master. And so what's being sought, if you regard domination as your criteria of what you've got to avoid, is non-domination. That is an absence of this form of mastery. Oops. Sorry about this. So how can it be avoided? Well, classic way of avoiding it is to tackle those three dominating circumstances through creating a democratic system of some kind that, to a greater or lesser extent, obviously no democratic system is going to be perfect, is going to reduce imbalances of political power and subject and of dependency, and subject not just the government and public administration to a certain accountability, reducing their personal discretionary power over citizens, but also through democratically created laws, also operate to reduce domination horizontally between private actors. And there are different accounts of how that might work in the domestic case. I've provided my account of a domestic situation in a book called Political Constitutionalism. But even if you had a perfect system domestically, in an interconnected world, that domestic democracy can be vitiated by external interferences of various kind. The negative externalities of democratic decisions by another state. If you've got good environmental policies and they've got bad environmental policies, their pollution will affect you through negative externalities. Inequalities in bargaining power between rich and poor states, for example, the intimidation that a powerful neighbor can have on you if it's a strong military force. Various transnational social and economic forces, multinational companies that can withdraw their labor from you or their finance from you as a state if they can get a better deal elsewhere, and political processes like terrorism that operate in a transnational way. So how can you preserve yourself from that? Because those can all be sources of domination. And democracy comes in here. One way to avoid this scenario is to create an association of democratic states that seek to mutually negotiate their interrelations with each other in ways which are guard against inequalities of power and of dependency, and also allows them to tackle certain global problems together. And on my account, the EU can be seen in such terms. That is, to quote a phrase, is a way by which the member states take back control, because it enables them to deal with these potentially dominating forces, which is something arguably the EU is beginning to, its complaints, that having complained that it was dominated by the EU, it really is being dominated by the EU now, potentially in trade negotiations, because the EU is simply the bigger partner. So the argument then is, well, you have the EU is in some regards a democracy, but it's also in some regards a democracy. That is, it's not made up of the individual member states, but it's also created a system where citizens have their own status and standing. Wouldn't that be the better way of dealing with the prospect of domination in an interconnected world, simply to create larger and larger formations, democratic formations? And this is where I think democracy and domination come in, because I think one of the, there are both pragmatic and principled reasons why the EU has yet to move fully in this direction. Of course, there are elements, but arguably those elements are still subordinate elements to its basically member state character. So if a democracy is going to be formed in a non-dominating way, then it's got to be something that the various demoi mutually agree to, consulting with their citizens. And we've had one attempt at this, which was the failed ratification of the constitutional treaty. And so one reason for saying we're a democracy is that it doesn't seem people are ready for it to become a democracy yet. But what drives that reluctance is arguably the very forms of heterogeneity that give rise to differentiated integration. That is, cultural and political forms of heterogeneity, which are often associated with sovereignty DI, and socioeconomic heterogeneity that's often associated with capacity DI. And it's precisely the worry that those issues will be lost in a democracy at the EU level that in a sense renders citizens reluctant to integrate that far. And from a principle point of view, democracy, in order to avoid the tyranny of the majority and hence domination issues, there are three main sort of ways or criteria that have to, conditions that have to be satisfied: a shared public sphere with values and of discourse, roughly equal stake in the common policies, and most importantly, cross-cutting cleavages, which give rise to what Dahl famously called polyarchy and minorities rule. And absent those conditions, you get what are called segmental cleavages and consistent and intense minorities, and as a result, the possibility of domination. So there are two ways to overcome that, which you find present in some of the member states, indeed. One is a consociationalism at the central level and forms of proportionality in the executive and the bureaucracy and consensual decision-making. And the other way of dealing with it, which is often in combination with this to some degree, is effectively forms of DI. You get self-government rights and often asymmetrical devolution to particular regions, special representation rights often, which guarantee certain groups a threshold representation in central decision-making, and special legislative rights, which allow for opt-outs and special privileges. And DI of this nature is then combined often with a single market, free movement, no discrimination between people coming from different regions within the state. So all of this is rather familiar from an EU point of view. And I think it's so important to note there's often a trade-off between the first and the second, that if you like, you need more consensus in central decision-making, the less differentiation or possibilities of differentiation that you allow. Whereas if you allow the possibility for opt-outs and differentiation in particular decisions, then there's a greater acceptance of majority decision-making at the central level. So that's what we notice in many federal arrangements. And so DI within the EU has a certain, it parallels what you find within many of its member states, such as Spain and Belgium. The difference is that whereas within a member state, it tends to be something which gets devolved downwards, in the EU, of course, it's the member states devolving upwards particular powers. And what in a sense avoids that becoming itself dominating is if that process is done consensually, according to what in the book Adapting Famous Arguments, I call it a sort of normative logic of a two-level game. It's got to be acceptable both to your fellow partners amongst the different member states, but also to your domestic citizens. So you have to somehow get that right. So that, in a sense, then suggests when DI might itself be dominating. It's dominating when it's imposed by other member states arising out of a situation of inequality and dependency and personal rule. It's when there isn't this mutual process of agreement that DI could have, can happen. It's when the exclusions aren't temporary and they aren't accompanied by leveling up measures. And it's when the opt-outs are motivated by free riding or the avoidance of fair burden sharing. So opting out of fair burden sharing in processing of migrants into the EU could be one example of a closing out particular people from states from Schengen without the prospect of them becoming part of the Schengen area or part of the euro if they so desire, would likewise be forms of dominating DI. So to conclude, it's DI, as I see, is a way of avoiding domination with a democratic EU. It follows from this notion of double consent in a way. It parallels measures to accommodate cultural diversity, especially minority nationalism and socio-economic diversity within states by various sovereignty measures or capacity measures. And the aim is to try and overcome inequality and dependency and personal rule, either at the central level, but DI really operates as a way of not creating blockages and veto points in central decision making, but allowing that not to happen by giving the opportunity of opting out and having differentiation within the member states themselves. So the gain for the EU that comes from DI is that it potentially allows a more flexible decision-making at the central level. Some might say this is a transitionary phase, so you could legitimate it in those grounds and sort of say, yeah, eventually DI won't be necessary. But my view is that if you look at the way in which heterogeneity operates within the member states, that's probably wishful thinking, and that DI is going to be with us forever, really. And it's legitimate and justified that it does so. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful timekeeping as well, much appreciated by the moderator. And I also see a question almost coming in, at least being announced. So we wait for that to come fully out. But I guess we best first move to our second speaker, John-Eric Fossum. Can I ask you to share your screen and take the floor?
Thank you. I will try to upload my my presentation. So do you see it?
Yes, coming up. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Richard was invited to attend a conference in January that we organized, where we would have addressed this, and now we have a new opportunity to address this. And as Ben was saying, this is an important book that requires a thorough investigation and debate. I I'm structuring my my talk according to the questions that the that animated this panel. So I'll basically start by addressing first the first question: does differentiated integration advance democracy by allowing EU's multiple demoi or peoples greater scope to choose the extent to which they are willing to pool their sovereignty with others across different policy domains? So I'll start with that and flesh out my position as I go along. And then, or does it instead lead to an increase in domination as the choices of some member states are effectively subordinated to those of their larger and more powerful neighbors? Okay, so I'll start with the first question. Now, the first point is that all political systems are differentiated. So I'm starting going back to the basic modern political systems and arguing that we have to think that all systems are differentiated functionally and territorially, and of course that the EU is based on a very specific configuration of differentiation along territorial, functional, and hierarchical lines. And of course, thinking about this, democracy also relies on differentiation, a division of labor among the institutions in order to ensure a viable representative democracy. So certain forms of differentiation are associated with our modern understanding of democracy. That also implies that there are certain forms that are less compatible, and some can be quite easily associated with dominance. So from this also follows that one has to distinguish between differentiation and differentiated integration or disintegration, where the former is more speaking about the basic structural configuration, and the latter is more talking about the process, even if the terms are used more flexibly. But basically, that's how I'm going to do it now. And then, of course, you have the temporal dimension, you have the question of scope and scale. All these themes have been addressed quite substantially in the conference. So I'll go and move to when can differentiated integration advance EU democracy, because certainly it can. The first is of course, if you have avant-garde member states who want to integrate further. But what I say in this that is somewhat on the democratic side, and that is that they must be fostering or stabilizing democracy. That this is the criterion. It's not simply differentiate the speed or advancing at a faster pace, but with the particular aim of stabilizing democracy at the European level. And from this, of course, you see that I start from a different perspective than Richard, that I acknowledge and also desire a form of democracy at the European level. And now I should add to this, because Richard is touching on this in a very nice way in his book, that party democracy, I think, is a really tricky one in the European Union setting. But that, to me, doesn't rule out the possibility of having some form of democracy that can stabilize a form of European demos. But it would be a demos of demoi. It is so it's not a democracy where you have a centralized European level, but it really must be a much more decentralized federal system to take into account the heterogeneity of the member states. On this, we definitely agree. So my gripe is that I think that this can also be done and stabilized at the European level, partly because what I have as a problem here in terms of questions of justifications for them. Well, I'll come back to this. I'll run through these first. Okay. So there must be certain conditions when avant-garde members integrate further. And that is that they can integrate at different speeds, but the assumption should be that they end up at the same point. The conditions must be spelled out and must be transparent. The arrangements must be, in principle, open to all, and there should be no explicit exclusion. And it's, as I said, to reiterate, these must be compatible or supportive of democracy. So that was basically my also B point there. And also, I think it's important that these whatever we have should not undermine member state democratic arrangements. So this would be a condition in itself, because otherwise we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the conferral of powers. So this goes again up to my first point, and actually the second one, that this should be an additional condition, that it doesn't deplete democratic arrangements in the member states. And I also think that there is scope for differentiated implementation and also experimentalism, as we had seen this morning, that this also opens a scope for a local adaptiveness that is not incompatible with democracy as far as I can see it. And it opens up an exciting space of a form of flexibility that can still be susceptible for democracy. So I think that people can live with a substantial amount of in democracies do live with quite a bit of diversity, provided there is an understanding of the common frames and so forth. So there should be some kind of flexibility and local adaptation in this. And the EU's experimentation in this is very interesting also from a democratic perspective. So this is the sort of the positive aspects. Now, what about the arrangements where member states claim special status or exemptions? And I think we need to distinguish between what I call constitutive differentiation or status differences built into the system, and measures that enable member states to opt out of specific rules and regulations and so forth. These are very different levels of magnitude. The first one, of course, is of 4 categories. The first 2 are two-speed Europe or Europe of core and peripheral states, and the third and fourth, a la carte and Europe of clubs. I think that under certain circumstances, under certain rather specific circumstances, the 2 first could be compatible with democracy. The 2 latter I have major problems with, because it would be very difficult to have any kind of accountable, democratically authorized and accountable lines of governing in these 2 latter. That would also, of course, include the condominio. Now, what should I add to this on the 2 first? Well, obviously, if we go back to the European Convention, there was an EU suggestion on the Penelope draft. That is that states that wanted to develop a proper democratic constitution for the European Union signed on to this. And only those that accepted that and accepted those terms would actually be part of the constitutional arrangement. And that in itself would not be undemocratic. Now, of course, the rub is the relation to those that don't join. So what are the conditions then? Well, first of all, these conditions will be different when the EU itself is democratically and constitutionally legitimate in this sense. So that in itself would change the vector of this. And one possibility is then that the EU is actually more flexible, allowing for more flexibility of these outside states in terms of the type of arrangements they have. Also because the EU would be less susceptible to external domination, because what you see with the current EU, its own fragility means that it is extremely concerned about importing external sources of differentiation. Hence the rather strict stance on Brexit and other things. For me, also Switzerland, for me, I think there would be a merit in flexibilizing its 4 freedoms and developing a less rigid approach to a lot of this, but it's not going to happen as long as you have the threat of Brexit, and that this is actually forming the core of the EU. So this in itself is a limitation. So, and of course, inclusion for outside states should be possible, but then they have to sign up to the agreements that the internal states have. And also there has to be arrangements whereby of consultation and some form of inclusion also for those that are not, that are the outer circle. You could assume that the affiliated states in EFTA now would basically be more or less in the same category. Or so 2-tiered or 3-tiered arrangement or whatever is a possibility at least. So, but there are, of course, questions of exclusion, questions of lack of transparency and so forth, especially in the dividing line between those that have joined the constitutional system and those that haven't. I acknowledge that, but I don't think that the current EU is sufficiently resilient and stable to be able to sustain itself at its current situation, and therefore some measures I think are necessary, and this would be one possibility to explore. This is not very different from Fabrini's proposal in his latest book, by the way. And then what about differentiation and dominance? Now, I think I also think that Petit has made a very important contribution to dominance. I guess there are two Petits for me. That the first Petit is more into structural aspects, and therefore and also relying more on the legal provisions. And I think that type of balance between legal and democratic institutions, this is where I would differ somewhat from Richard. I believe that the legal and rights-based dimensions are more important as counterweights against dominance, and I don't have the same faith in the political dimension to sort this as Richard has. So I do believe it has to be some type of different balance in understanding and countering dominance, basically. But the basic formats of dominance, otherwise, I don't think we disagree that much, because I think we use more or less the same terms. But I think we understand these in different, the effects they have differently, because we have a different view of what the EU is and should be. And I also say is, actually, and I think this is very important to underline, because for me, especially the internal market or the community system of the EU is based on a institutional configuration where, according to Scharf, you have a system that basically, voting procedures that basically favor market making and not market correcting. At the same time, with Wessels, you have this system being fused with the member states. So it's not so that states have conferred authority on EU institutions that are separate from themselves. They are baked into this. So this type of fusion in itself is, to me, a deeply problematic element. And Richard is touching on some of this also in his book. But I draw a different conclusion from this. I draw a conclusion from this that it locks in states and embeds them in a system so that they are also hamstrung. And the more integration happens, the more this reinforces this type of hamstringing. And therefore, so that's why I would advocate the necessity of having a democratic control mechanism that speaks to the citizens of Europe at the European level as a way of countering this. Because I think that the democratic solution that Richard is painting is too prone to executive dominance. I don't think the two-level guarantees that he has are adequate. And the other problem I see also with including national parliaments in this system is actually that you can have structural co-optation, that they can be implicit in decisions that they really should have adverse views on, and especially in majoritarian systems where parliaments are very much reliant on the executive. They don't have the institutional standing to be independent, and therefore they cannot actually express the dissent in the same way as. So you'll have a very uneven type of national parliamentary protective mechanism at the European level. So that's why I think it is necessary to have a strong European Parliament. I think Richard is very right in saying that how this should be embedded in society is a real problem. We cannot expect this to be embedded in parties when parties have undergone significant transformations, both towards cartel parties and towards the fragmentation and populism and so forth. Parties are not reliable as pillars, as Peter Mayer was very rightly pointing out, but we still need institutions that people can identify with at the European level that can serve as correctives and see and that have an independent stance in relation to the executives and the courts at the European level. And I was, in my presentation yesterday, I was talking about a segmented political order is exhibiting some of these features of that can actually develop into domination because large-scale states can dominate this. So the institutional democratic features at the European level need to be able to arrest these types of tendencies and operate to desegment these types of patterns. At the same time, this next point about fragility, vulnerability also can engender dominance because of the lack of proper order and accountability. Now, the last element is of course the non-membership, and the book that Ben mentioned we did in 2015 on non-members. Of course, we talked about voluntary submission under a hegemonic policy, and this is a very tricky and interesting situation for non-members. But there is more scope to discuss this. In principle, yes, it is definitely a case of dominance. It's a self-imposed dominance. But the EU is actually a paternalistic. It's a case of paternalistic democracy, because the regulations they import are democratically legitimated by the EU, but not by the nation state Demoi. So the question you get is, are all these provisions then problematic? Or is it so that you need a sorting mechanism to find out which ones are problematic? Because after all, we live in a globalized situation. So should all of these arrangements then be considered problematic, or should there be some kind of, from a normative perspective, should there be some kind of sorting mechanism that allows to sort out which ones are problematic? Now, I think I have made a mistake, because I should have brought up one question to Richard also. The last point on this I didn't actually touch on, and this is an interesting one for Demoi-cracy. In case a member state systematically violates core constitutional and democratic norms and rules, is the decision of a majority of member states to evict the member from the EU consistent with a democratic DI? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to get to this, the Orban question, I guess, in the end. But we're already getting some questions on the Q&A. And I want to start in a way from the relatively more simple, straightforward questions and tease out a bit the differences before we move to deeper questions also about constitutionalization, maybe about the Eurozone. The way I read your conversation, let's call it a conversation, it's very much that in the end, Richard is more voluntaristic in his assumption. If a state feels this does not feel right, it can opt out. And basically that right is part of what it can do. Now, John Eric, I think, makes a number of observations that relate to the overarching structure and the responsibilities that you owe to that. And most concretely, he, for instance, rejects the option of a Europe à la carte. Now, I think my first question to Richard is very much, to what extent would, if you follow your normative principles, a Europe à la carte be a logical conclusion and a normatively acceptable one? And one of the questions is to what extent can you differentiate, or to what extent does your allegiance to whatever union membership may mean not owe some kind of commitment to remain part of the whole, and not to say, well, I want to be part of the union, but hey, I don't like this, so I want to opt out. It's like a marriage where sometimes you say, well, I'm happy to have breakfast with you, but my evenings I'm spending everywhere. But maybe the idea of a marriage, or maybe the idea of a very union, presupposes a broader commitment to the whole than just a pick and choose mentality. Or maybe there are more overarching duties or burden of proofs that you would want to insert here, or does in principle your perception, which is very much starts from the democratic autonomy of individual member states, might it well issue into a Europe à la carte, and would that be fine? You have to unmute.
Okay, yes. So I think that the default position, for my view, is full membership. In other words, something exists, you decide whether you want to confer power on it. So it's then, well, what are the reasons that you might give to request opt-outs? Because the Putnam-esque two-level game means that it's got to be agreed by your partners within the association, as well as with your domestic citizens. So my argument isn't for a à la carte view. It's rather to allow flexibility within a union where the default position is that everybody is a full member. But there can be good reasons to not be a full member in various elements.
All right, I think that's very helpful, and it makes you less voluntarist and indeed more unionist, I guess, than it might have read in the first place.
Yeah.
I guess this is where I can also bring in one of the questions that has been raised on the Q&A. You may have read it already, but I'm going to read it to you as well. It's come from a law colleague from us at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, Bert-Jan Woothuis, and he writes, well, I think also under the conditions that you just spelled out, member states are allowed to opt out of certain integration projects. So the Euro or Schengen, you can justify that. However, if we would go a level further down, if you think of the single market, would it also be legitimate still to kind of pick and choose within an integration project like the single market? So he refers in particular to some proposals that have been floated in the context of Brexit, the UK withdrawing from part of the single market that it liked, that it didn't like, and staying in other parts. I mean, so we're really talking about within policy domains. Would you be able to get to a normative settlement on opting in of just parts of, in this case, the single market, or would that violate the integrity of that policy domain? And in that sense, can opting out only take place at a certain level of comprehensiveness of a policy domain? And mute yourself.
I don't think, I mean, of course, it depends. In a way, it's hard to do this abstractly. One has to do it with concrete examples. But, you know, take two of the issues that I think were important in the UK debate, though often rather misunderstood. So one view was whether you could refuse tax credits to workers who had come from other EU countries. So in other words, you developed a purely domestically funded scheme to try and reduce unemployment by making low-paid jobs more eligible to poorer people within the local community. Should that then be open to people from poor member states who would immediately get, if you like, a boost to the income? So you effectively have a domestic measure which was then funding that. I think in this particular case, it is legitimate, actually. I mean, there's a reading of the single market rules which would not render it legitimate, but I think that it was a justified domestic measure. Another issue is that was, you know, much debated and still is. It's now part of the internal market bill issues. That is whether it's possible for the state to nationalize certain sectors of the economy. And again, you know, of course, I mean, this is likewise a bit of a gray area as to whether it's opposed to the single market or compatible with it. But I'm inclined to think that it can be, you know, a reasonable choice. I mean, I don't know. The Italian railway system is largely nationalized, and by and large to its great benefit. And I think of the British railway system and think it would be beneficial, certainly, to nationalize parts of it. So I think often the debate was putting forward these kind of areas where sometimes the operation of the single market would work better for the particular member states if they were given a higher degree of discretion, fiscal discretion, which is something which of course has been undercut by the euro to some in certain areas. But I think that this is the sort of one size that fits all that sometimes has meant that the single market hasn't worked to the advantage of all states and all people within those states, particularly sometimes the poorer sections, and a bit of flexibility would actually improve it.
Very, very clear. Thank you, Richard. I mean, and actually, I think what we're here talking about is maybe less opt-outs of whole packages and more, say, flexibility in implementation or discretion in implementation that might come to accommodate. And I think, I think it's a very interesting case, of course, what happens to public transport and to railway systems. I don't think that Brussels has ever objected to the nature of the Italian railways. I actually think that quite a number of national governments have used Europe as a nice excuse to move forward with privatization where it wasn't necessarily called for by the single market, but served a certain political agenda very well. Anyway, I'm going to turn to Jan Erik. I mean, I'm just very curious. So I try to put Richard a bit into the corner of being too voluntaristic, but he came back and said, well, no, of course, full union membership should be the default, differentiation should be the exception, and you need this kind of two-level consent to have this legitimated, and it's, a lot of this is about flexibility. So I was just curious, does that mean that you guys agree, or would you want to push the sense of full obligation towards union membership a bit further than Richard still, or are you actually on the same page on this?
No, I don't think we are completely on the same page. I appreciate the fact of flexibility, as Richard was saying, also in federations and so on, but I think it has a lot to do with where the flexibility lies. And I think this probably is one of the problems with the EU, in that its core lies in the internal market, and this is of course an upside down federation compared to states, and therefore the standard notions of external controls and so on are not there. And what this means is that the whole way of thinking about sovereignty has changed in the European Union, because the way of understanding sovereignty in the EU is not about controlling borders in a state-wise fashion and territorial control, but it's membership in the membership entails, the core issue for me is membership entails presence in the decision-making institutions in the EU. So this is in itself, so that comes also with a number of obligations. And this is the rub, so that the type of flexibility then leads to all kinds of problems of inequalities and so on, if one flexibilizes this too much in the way these institutions are configured, unless one develops a stronger kind of presence at the central level. This is, I think the irony in this is that you could possibly have more forms of diversity in certain areas if you had a more present, more visible, and more capacious government at the EU level with ability to redistribute. Because to come back to the example that Richard talked about in terms of the single market, I think one of the problems is that the whole debate about the single market was couched too much in neoliberal terms to have the state retreat. What it means is that the states that signed up have not taken sufficient responsibility for the effects, especially on the dislocated workers and people in their own countries of the mobility. We saw this very clearly in Brexit. The UK government was abandoning the people in Northern England, and they should have compensated for the losses that these people felt from the high mobility, because the UK was benefiting tremendously from this. But that also means that the longer people stay in the country, the greater stake they have in the system that they are in. So, I mean, I think the question is, because Richard is also using the idea of stakes, I agree with that. So one should find a clear line from when can you determine that people have sufficient stake, also to be able to be part of the pension systems and so forth in such a system. But I think you could get some way to this if the states themselves took more responsibility. And the rub here, of course, is that capacities are so different across states, because the northern states would have the capacity to compensate. Like, one of the reasons why Norway has so little opposition to the EEA membership and so on is because we have a very capacious state and is capable of compensating for the ill effects of globalization and so forth. Now, I don't, in those states with limited capacities, I think there has to go through some kind of solidaristic measures through the EU level. And that's why I think that needs to be stabilized. So these elements limit the scope for maneuver in the sense that there are certain types of commitment. And I think that also has to do with fairness and social justice in the EU system itself. That there are certain obligations that follow, on reciprocal obligations that follow states when they enter into these types of arrangements.
That's very interesting. It also suggests in a way that there's not necessarily an opposition between centralization and differentiation, but that actually more centralization may allow for more differentiation if you bring resources available at the central level. But before I pursue that, I'd be very curious also in a way to hear whether Richard would agree that say a greater capacity to redistribute at the European level might make it might soften or increase the capacity to allow for differentiation. But I think I want to also use this moment to pick up on a question that has been raised in the Q&A by Stefan Teller, who asks. So we talked about the single market, and that may in a way have perverted the political system of the EU, but maybe even more strongly that has been the case with the euro. Richard has mentioned it, and that may have given kind of a package deal that also with insufficient flexibility has led to dominance. Now the question that Stefan Teller poses refers to the proposal by Piketty and Fauché and others to say that if you want to accommodate that, then you should have a separate parliament for the Eurozone, besides the structure that we have for the Union as a whole. So that's called the TDEM, no? The Treaty for Democratizing the Eurozone. So that would be a form of differentiation. If one parliament doesn't cover it, why don't we have two? So Stefan Teller asks, what position do you take on this proposal for a TDEM treaty? And maybe we work backwards, start with John Eric to see whether he's on the side of Piketty or not, and then move to Richard.
Okay, thanks. Well, one of the things I think one has to be very careful about, and actually it's something I should have said when I talked about domination. So I'll take one quick step back now, and that is that one of the possible elements of manipulation in the EU is the fact that it doesn't actually have a constitution and therefore doesn't spell out what kind of system it is. And part of the debate we have is because we have not been given official clues as to what we should be understanding, how we should be understanding what we are confronting. I think this is in itself is a shirking of responsibility that borders on manipulation. So that this is the first step, that the whole questions of accountability is tricky because we don't know what kind of standard to place on the system. Now, then I was going to move on to I think I probably stepped too far back. Now,
where do you get to Piketty?
Yes, well, yes, and what I meant with this, what I meant with this, of course, is that the EU has used vocabulary and terms that come from nation-state-based democracy, and we should not use the term parliament too lightly in this. So, to have a democratic body or an auditing body, for instance, over at least in as a temporary measure that oversees the work of the executives, because obviously the Euro Council and so on is an informal instance, and it's a case of illicit hierarchy. It's a deeply problematic element because you don't have transparency, you don't know what goes in, and you don't know what goes on, and you don't know what goes out. So this is not an acceptable system from democratic perspective. But then to institute a parliament, then you're getting into the question of, well, what kind of jurisdiction for whom? And if one uses and dignifies this with the term parliament and also has this elected by us people to elect this, I think one has to be very specific to citizens when one tries to establish a democratic link and say, look, what type of function this is supposed to have. We're using a very, very powerful, normatively significant vocabulary, and we should not be using that lightly in this. So if what I was saying earlier in terms of a two-tiered union, you can have a parliament for Eurozone, but then that will be the dominant parliament for the European Union. And the citizens of the Eurozone would then be the core members of the EU, and this has to be institutionalized in a formalized arrangement. Simply adding a parliament to this is actually a deceptive measure, and I think it undermines people's faith in any element of democracy, and say they're playing with symbols the whole time. So I see that the intentions are good, but I would not call it a parliament. And I don't know if under the current circumstances this is right, and also for the elements of exclusion. Besides, this also is a convenient measure and shirks the whole point about the fact that the other members have, formally speaking, signed on to be part of the Eurozone. So I think it's better to reform the Eurozone and get that on the right keel by establishing fiscal measures than to try to establish a kind of measure like this, because it could even consolidate the current situation. That to me is untenable, certainly from a dominance perspective.
Right. So incorporate the euro in the EU-wide structure and democratize it from there, rather than create a new separate parliament that may raise different the wrong expectations and may actually hijack the EU project as a whole. That's, if I summarize it. Is that your position as well, Richard, or would you favor the Piketty proposal?
I do favour. I indeed, on pages 206 to 7 of the book, I discuss it and favour it. Now, there's one feature of his proposal which hasn't been mentioned, which is that it's an interparliamentary body. So, in other words, it's made up of representatives from the existing national parliaments plus the European Parliament. And one of the sort of sub-themes of my book is that one way of enhancing the democratic accountability of the EU and the direct involvement of politicians and citizens in it is if more weight is given to national parliaments. So it's within that context that I agree. And Piketty's argument is that if more kind of power of a redistributive nature is to, or even of a lending nature is to be given to the EU, and the European Central Bank is to take a more proactive role, then it needs to be rendered more accountable, but more accountable to the bodies which have spending power within the states, which is the national parliament. So I agree with the logic of his argumentation, though I make a few minor kind of tweaks to his actual suggestion, or his and his co-author's actual suggestion. And one of the reasons why I favour it, and also don't favour, to go back to the first part of your question, which was, you know, rendering the EU more, giving it a greater redistributive role, is that I fear that it will fall foul to what Philip van Parijs calls Hayek's trap. Both Wolfgang Streeck and Philip van Parijs both have been rather influenced by an article by Hayek's from 1939 called The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. And in that article, Hayek says, well, you know, the differences between the different states is such that if you really want to lead to neoliberal policies, give them a chance, then you do so by creating an interstate federal Europe, where it's unlikely that, as he puts it, the French peasant will be willing to pay more for his fertilizer to help the British chemical industry going. Which, you know, despite its slightly dated character, nonetheless, I think one sees elements of that over the Greek bailout, for example, the recent discussions that are going on about solidarity in the EU. And, you know, Hayek sort of said, I mean, I think he's not quite right, but he said the restriction of child labor or of working hours would become problematic within such a union. And I think, so that's my worry. And that's most of my arguments are about how can one keep what I think are undoubtedly the beneficial aspects of the EU without producing this kind of entering the Hayekian trap. And I see the Euro crisis as having signaled the potential for that Hayekian trap being there.
Just follow up on that. I mean, what you seem to suggest here is very much that, in that sense, the EU as it is has reached something that Andrew Morasik has famously called something like constitutional equilibrium. That the dream that this has to move forward and inevitably has to end, kind of issue into a more redistributive scheme, a more political union, that maybe this is as good as it gets. But now we also get questions here about that there's still pressure, of course, for a core Europe, for something like a core that would indeed move forward on, well, I guess there's mainly two strands that invite that. One is indeed a closer, more unified foreign policy role, and one is indeed a more kind of social solidarity redistributive role. So I guess most people identify with Macron as pushing for something of an agenda where a subset of member states, something close to the Eurozone, could come to form something like a core Europe. Do you think that's a viable and a normatively desirable trajectory? Or would you rather say, if you want to keep the union together and if you want to indeed keep collective ownership of all the Demoi there, then a core Europe may just be the wrong step to make in any case?
I think so. I think the latter. I mean, I think the foreign policy, yes, there is a case for having a more unified foreign policy and possibly even an army. I think indeed that almost the EU is going to need to do that, unfortunately, because there's going to be a withdrawal of US support, and there is the ever-present danger of Russia on its doorstep. So,
and you see that happen with 27 member states?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's an aspiration that happens, and actually, I think it's one area where if the UK is to be brought back into the fold, that would be an area where I mean, it's got a lot of bargaining power, and potentially it's beneficial for the EU. I think one of the difficulties is the UK sort of has overbid on its bargaining power in that area, but it still is an important area. But I think social solidarity will be damaged by greater integration. So that's my concern on that area, and I think that social mobility and structural funds are the best way forward in dealing with those issues.
Okay, so in the current setup, we're pretty much in socio-economic terms we are where we are, and we can optimize that, but we should not aspire to big leap forward there. No.
Okay. I don't think it's. I think it's liable to be illegitimate to do so and prove unjustifiable in the end. So that's, you know, I do think that is Hayek's trap, in my view.
Yeah, very clear. So I'm actually paraphrasing, I guess, a question that Stefan Teller raised earlier, and I'm also going to put it then to John Eric. I mean, I mean, he actually talks, and you probably like the language, to talk about a constitutional moment, creating a constitutional moment among a limited number of member states. But I read it as another phrase of saying, well, a constitutionalized core Europe. You think that's a normatively desirable and indeed realistically viable prospect for Europe to steer towards? I mean, this may be the Macronian dream. John Eric, what's your view on that?
As I said, under certain circumstances, I think the division of members can be acceptable from a democratic perspective. Now, what I think one has to be careful with is the vocabulary, because the core Europe immediately talks about a dominant core. Now, I think that as Richard was saying, the idea for the Union to have a stronger system of external protections in a more volatile world, because we have been discussing interdependence and so on, but from a rather benign perspective. And I think that had the world moved in a situation of you had regulated trade agreements and so on between states, there wouldn't have been need for this more state-type features or to increase the role of these at the European level. And then the European Union could have been a civilian power Europe and so forth, that Duchenne's dream early on to have douche commerce, as Hirschman is saying. But unfortunately, this is not the case. And there are external pressures and uncertainties, and the EU's external vulnerability in relation to big powers feeds into itself internally, as well as its relations to non-members. And I think this is the reality. So the world has changed and become less predictable. Hence, if Europe wants to protect its own social and economic model, whatever is left of it, it needs to have stronger external protections like this. But with that also comes a different division of burdens inside the European Union. I think that means that the European Union needs a stronger fiscal clout. What I also think comes with that fiscal clout is that the EU can be more flexible it will have more flexible means of relating to difference and diversity. I think this is the irony of the current situation. Namely, because the EU is a regulatory machine, very much of the differentiation has to go through law and structure. And these are the most problematic elements of differentiating, because they become permanent. They generate status differences, whereas fiscal distributive measures and so on can be negotiated. And you can set up criteria of redistribution as federal states have in order to target certain areas that are particularly vulnerable. And yes, of course, then for that you need some kind of coercive power to tax people. I'm sorry, but this is the reality, and I would sign on to this. I think that's a necessary element. However, what is also, I think, important is, and this is where my point about the core comes in, we have to be very careful about not equating with centralization with federalization or democratization. They are different. Any lifting of powers to the European level should be subject to clear democratic controls. And also, one has to be very much more careful about what type of competences are actually then conferred to the European level. I think one should roll back elements and flexibilize elements of the internal market as a part of that type of agreement, and not have so many of these detailed regulations and so on, and develop as flexible means as possible to get economic activities going, and that also are sufficiently sensitive to issues of the green transition, that are more future-oriented, so that they are not simply focused on the market and free capital and these elements and so on, and to regulate and to take these out as part of the deal, so that states should not sign on to a system where they are completely being hamstrung by the system. And I think that the current construction of the internal market is too centralizing. It's without proper accountability. This is what I tried to sketch earlier. So the ironic element on my point of making the European institutions more independent is also that they would be clearer targets for attack. At the present system, states can play shapeshift actions, and they can support European level arrangements when they want to, and they can go back and claim national victories and address themselves to the national arenas at the same time. So this is a very difficult situation with lots of scope for structural manipulation, that I think the rendering of the European Union as a more separate system with a certain level of competences that are also more contained, also with some intergovernmental elements that are controlling this also. In certain areas, you have to have states much more prominently involved in this. And just this about the internal market. Craig Parsons is doing a comparison between the EU and the US, and he finds that there is more harmonization and so on in Europe now than there is in many areas in the US. Now, to me, this makes sense because we have had so much flexible harmonization in the EU, which of course means that the de-differentiation element, the market-driven de-differentiation, is actually a problem in Europe, because this is also happening in a relatively unaccountable way, driven by courts and business actors and so on. So you're getting this market citizenship up as a competitor to individual citizenship, and this to me is also a very problematic development in this.
That's a nice bridge to a couple of questions that we have lying here, where people are still a bit struggling. Like, aren't we using a very elaborate, new, innovative vocabulary to capture things that have actually been on the political menu for a long time? So Dupes Pitors here asks, how does the practice of differentiation, integration and democracy really differ from more traditional notions of confederalism? Aren't we simply talking about we think of the US as a federation even, and you're just highlighting now that actually it allows for more differentiation and less harmonization than the EU does. So if we go back to those classical terms, and also I guess also referring to a question that I have here from Jan Peter Bates, to tease out a bit the differences between you. Can't we say that that what we're talking about is simply a form of confederation that would do the job of what we're talking about? Maybe first, following the thread that John Erik was already laying out. I mean, could you just comment on that, John Erik?
Richard in. Well, actually,
some of the reverse order. Yeah.
Well, look, what my purpose has been is to try to normalize the vocabulary and to try to develop them, to link up with the sort of statist vocabulary in also bringing back differentiation, because this is a standard term in political science going back a long way, and of course still allowing for the specific features we have in the European Union. But I think, I think, I mean, the Germans discussed this for a long time, whether it was federal or confederal, and you've had a lot of debates about this. Now, this is still happening within a statist frame, and I think we have to admit to the fact that the EU is not a state, and therefore that we also need vocabulary that captures this type of situation. So if we simply use the state type language, we would also be missing out on the innovative elements in the European Union itself, and I think this would be a loss. So we need a different type. You could, I mean, Demoi-cracy to some extent, and I know Jan Peter asked a question along these lines yesterday. Of course, Demoi-cracy also has to do with Taylor's idea of deep diversity. Now, pushing Richard, I don't know how different your position is from this understanding of deep diversity that Taylor has. I think it is, what I think is a difference is that Taylor says that there is a democratic level and that the subunits would have recognition, but within certain terms set by the overarching system. And you are saying more that the subunits should be setting more of the terms of their interaction. Now, this is, what you are sketching is different from a confederal system, because you also allow for a more direct presence also at the European level. So this is an intermediary system between a confederal and a federal. But we still can mine, we can still mine the federal terminology, but we need to make one important change. That is, we got to go away from the standard status notion of sovereignty. So we have to get into what Arato talks about as a post-sovereign condition, and think that there are different ways of thinking about territory, function, and so forth from a federal perspective. Then the criteria conditions will be different in a federal setting than they would be in the statist set. So we have still stuck in the statist framework while we are discussing the European Union, which is not a state, and therefore requires also certain types of additional terms in order to capture what it is. And I still, so in that sense, the European Union is not confederal by any stretch. It is, I think it is in the federal terrain, but it suffers from a Preston King's problem, namely that it looks like a federation, but it doesn't have an agreed upon federalism. So the agreement to federate is not there. Therefore, this hasn't been spelled out, and this is one of the limitations. So this is also the ultimate in terms of normative political accountability, to spell out and to agree, to set out the terms. These are set out in the treaties, but these are not adequate because there is not a normative overarching structure that they have compelled themselves to. That's why it's so difficult to hold people accountable to any of this. But the structure that we're talking about is not confederal. It is more than that. It has lock-in features and so forth that are problematic, and in some ways it can be more subversive, and it can be more oppressive than a federation can be in some ways.
Well, let's move to Richard. I mean, the same question for you, indeed. I mean, John Erik already kind of prepared laid the ground for you, but
yeah.
We have the question, indeed, is from Gio Pitors about, can't we simply understand the EU as a confederation? But Jan-Peter Bates adds to that, isn't what Richard is sketching exactly something that comes very close to a very decentralized but federal system with a strong parliament? So where do you stand on this? Does that vocabulary, do you still want to, can you still use that vocabulary, or would you rather shy away from it, and what are the reasons why you wouldn't adopt it?
Yes, well, I mean, I think I partly agree with John Erik on this. So there's, yes, between democracy and confederalism, there are certain family resemblances of approach. But the big distinction is that the member states are sovereign states, and the EU is not a sovereign state. And that's a big difference. I mean, a rather old book, one which I think deserves to be better known, is a book by Murray Forsyth called Union of States. And he was somebody who was very interested in the normative political theory of federalism, and looked at it's an early book about the EU, but he precisely, I think, got the notion that it was a union of states without itself being having state-like qualities. And I think that that's the original sui generis character of the EU, though one with a certain historical lineage. I mean, I think that there was a big debate in the 18th century about notions of federations between states, of which Kant's Perpetual Peace is one of the best known contributions, all around Europe, interestingly. And I think one argument that was quite common then, but which we've sort of lost, is precisely that an association of states did not itself have to become a state, and so that's the difference that I would say there. So that's why the new vocabulary, in a sense, is helpful to a degree, but it's also true that what I've also wanted to say sometimes is that people sometimes have stronger views of what the EU should do in terms of unitariness and uniformity than is true of many of its component parts. And so that's another thing I want to draw attention to. So I don't think thinking about comparative politics is unhelpful. I think it's very helpful when thinking about the EU, but you still have to understand that it's different to most states.
Thank you so much. We're running into the final 6 minutes, and as Richard will have to teach pretty soon after that, we can't be much longer. But I already promised that I would have the Orban question still on the table, and it's also raised by Yazid in the Q&A. And of course, we've talked a lot about flexibility and about differentiated implementation. So on the one hand, the question is very much how much, I mean, to what extent do we have constitutional tolerance? And to what extent can we allow member states to have their own particular and maybe contestable conceptions of rule of law and democracy. That's the one side of the question. And the other side of the question is, of course, what can you do? And to what extent can we use, can you mobilize member states to exclude others from certain arrangements for the sake of that they are found to fall short of certain normative standards? So, so to what extent does differentiation integration allow us to accommodate and address differences in the maintenance of rule of law and democracy? And I guess I'm going to turn first again to Richard and then to John Eric.
So I've actually been thinking about this over the summer, and I've recently completed with co-authors a paper on whether tackling the argument of Dan Kellerman that constitutional pluralism and differentiated integration, in a certain sense, are a gift to Orban and co. That they provide a legitimation of it. And I think what's wrong about that thesis is that the rationale for these are precisely democratic ones, whereas the rationale for democratic backsliding is precisely a retreat from democracy. So you can have a sort of minimal account of constitutional democracy, which is in fact assumed by arguments for differentiated integration and constitutional pluralism, which nonetheless, is consistent entirely with the Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, which is the focus of democratic backsliding. So I think that that argument that it's a gift to Orban and co is incorrect, and it doesn't look into the checks and balances which are involved in this alternative system. Because of course, I mean, Kellerman in particular argues that you have to strongly federalize the union in order to overcome this possibility. But then, of course, that doesn't guard against the union itself being taken over by Orban-like figures. And we were talking earlier about the US election. Well, I think one can see it's not a unreal danger that can happen. And so I do think that that's important. I just want to, if I may, also answer because John Eric had a little piece in his presentation on this issue, so he was sort of saying, would it be permissible to democratically exclude such a state? I do think there is one problem, which is, Article 50 suggests that withdrawal from the union should be consistent with the constitutional processes and democratic processes of a member state. But of course, those are precisely what are called into question by democratic backsliding. So that, if one's thinking about a population where maybe a large minority, possibly even a majority, given that the opportunity for them to vote is constrained, would like to stay in the union. I think the alternatives, which unfortunately are being discussed but have now been severely weakened, of putting into force conditionality with regard to receipt of EU funds, and what actually in the paper that I was referring to, we call value DI, that is differentiation on the grounds of excluding certain states from participation in voting in the council, for example, as a result of them not signing up to particular values, that those are better and more legitimate avenues than expulsion for dealing with this problem.
Thank you. It doesn't make it quite easy, but I think the stance is quite clear that DI is not an excuse for democratic backsliding. To what extent we can mobilize it to deal with it, that's a bigger chance. And I guess on that note, I'll have to hand the last word to Jon Erik to present his views about to what extent the presumptions of the theory of democratic integration, that differentiated integration that you presented, can actually be effectively used as a litmus test to intervene and to know when and how we can intervene in these cases of Hungary and Poland and other cases that have now been identified by the Commission's publication yesterday, actually. Jon Erik.
Thanks. Well, I guess, I mean, first of all, few states actually have procedures by which subunits can exit in the first place. Canada has, and has set down some very wise procedures for this. I think this is something that one can build into a federal constitution, just to put, this is a voluntary exit, of course. And again, then democracy is not at stake. If democracy is at stake, the equation changes quite a bit. Now, I think one element in this anyway is credibility. Can the EU itself credibly eject a non-member for not being democratic when it would not qualify for membership itself in the EU? So the EU's own credibility at current is at stake. If the member states did this and were credible, maybe it's a possibility. But I think this is problematic. So at a minimum, if one were to go down this road, there would have to be a procedure whereby the people of the affected state will be directly consulted on this. So the mechanism couldn't be one. I mean, I don't think this will be legitimate for the EU to determine to eject a state, for instance, the European Council or whatever. I don't see that as being legitimate. There would have to be a procedure, and then in the end, if everything else fails, and it is clear that this state is deliberately and absolutely blocking or undermining democracy within the EU, some serious measure would have to be taken. But that measure, to me, would seem to require some kind of direct input from the people in the affected state, where they would be given the explicit choice of either shaping up or shaping out. So, I mean, this is a nuclear button, and it should not be used lightly. Because, I mean, what comes in as the equation in this is the more integrated you are, the higher the bar for exit, basically. So because you have signed on more commitments, and rather one should try to hold you to the commitments rather than exiting, because ejection is also a signal that whatever value or commitment in the club is also quite limited. So a confederal system can easily eject a member because the stakes are much lower. But for the EU, with integrated and so on, one has to build up a much bigger type of framework. I wouldn't completely rule it out, though, because especially if it is so that a member were to deliberately undermine or sabotage the democratic operation of the system, or putting its own existence at stake, well, that's approaching that kind of point. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I actually see the way you spell this out, I think, opens an opportunity to apply the two-level normative game that Richard was referring to before in this context. I'm not sure that that's part of the paper that he has spent his holidays on, but I think that's for further discussion. I'm afraid we're already past time, and Richard is already kind of taking time of his. So we have to wrap up. I actually think we've kind of addressed, come quite full circle. There's still a couple of open questions on the Q&A, some of which I think we hopefully have touched, some of which for which I have to excuse at this stage. But I'm very grateful for this stimulating exchange. I think it was very civil, it was nice overlap, but also some helpful and instructive disagreements. So thanks again, Jon Erik Fossum from Oslo and Richard Bellamy from London for joining us and sharing your views on this. And I think with that I can conclude this session and thank ACES for...
Thank you also to the other participants.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.